Here for teaching history through comics. We've got a great group of panelists, including one who's on his way, and even though he's late, he's bringing free stuff
for you.
Yeah. So yeah, cheers to the currently absent Ryan Dunleavy, but he'll be here. We have Jeff Barbanel, Fred Van Lente,
Callista
Will, for a second.
Hi, guys.
My goodness.
Sorry.
And Tim Smythe, classroom teacher, here to talk about all the elements of how and why we should be teaching history through comics. Talking about the high-level stuff, the like how comics are made for the classroom. Looking at that from the publisher level as well as the creative side, and then also practical classroom applications. And everyone's going to talk a little bit about what they do, why they do it, and then we're going to leave space for questions from all of you. But first, to give you a little bit of background on Reading with Pictures, who we are and what we do. We're a 501c3 nonprofit that gets comics into schools and gets schools into comics. We're comics ambassadors. We run workshops, seminars, and professional development in schools and libraries all over the country and all over the world. This is me in Santiago, Chile, where I did work for the U.S. State Department, teaching teachers how and why to teach with comics all over the world. We've been to Germany, Japan, Belarus, Chile, although I don't really know that I had anything to teach anybody in Japan, but they sent me there anyway. We also organize panel programming and comic conventions across the U.S., like this one right here. We also created a book called Comics That Make Kids Smarter, distributed by Andrews McNeil Publishing. Over a dozen stories with topics drawn from McReal and Common Core standards, featured all sorts of wonderful, amazing books on all sorts of stories on all sorts of topics, from social studies to language arts, and things like history, including Action Presidents, by these two gentlemen right here. That's the story right there. It was aimed at 8th grades 3 through 6. We've been featured on NPR, the Atlantic Monthly Book List, and it's also been licensed by the State Department to use as a tool for teaching English in foreign countries around the world. So we also did something called Comics United Nations, which was a partnership with UNICEF and PCI Media Impact, where we created a series of comics, and we're still creating them. We have a panel on Sunday with UNICEF talking about the next round of this. Comics designed to educate and inform people the world over about the UN's global goals for sustainable development, which are the single largest global aid program of the next 20 years. And we played a big part in communicating that. The comics we created were distributed in over 160 countries in 16 different languages so far. So that's what Reading with Pictures does. We also have educational resources at readingwithpictures.org. We have the largest collection of educational comics content on our free database on that website. So if you want to not only use our resources but also contribute, if you created lesson plans or content of your own, it's a wiki-style database you can share, as well as you can upload as well as download. We encourage everyone to do that. And if you have more questions about the organization, you can find us at booth 2658 over in the main hall. So that's us, but now I want to get to the meat of this, and I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Barbanel to discuss kind of the high-level ideas.
Okay, can you hear me back there? All right, no.
So I don't know if these mics are working at all.
These mics are not working. All right.
Hello, hello. This one seems
Yeah,
it's
it's
working.
all good.
Give me that.
Yeah.
Give me that thing. All right. Hi, Jeff Barbanel. I've been involved with education and comics since I achieved my master's degree a decade ago, and was lucky enough to join the board of Reading with Pictures because of our shared goals. But this turnout and the kinds of things that have developed over the years is very heartening, because I've seen more and more of this type of learning in the curriculum. How many teachers do we have here in the audience? A lot. That's great.
Yowza.
Lots of educators, librarians. All right, excellent. So, I'm just going to briefly go over some of the theory that I started developing. Oh, there we go. Does that still work? All right, good.
They work.
Back when I went and got my degree. And first of all, one of the things we were hit with right off the bat is how to develop critical thinking. And with adding technology to the classroom, it's kind of like at odds. Can we develop critical thinking by just sending somebody to a website? I'm not so sure about that. What I usually do when I do professional development for teachers and librarians is we go over the goals of whether or not people want to learn how to use the different types of alternative media in their classroom, add that to the curriculum, or in the after-school space. We all know that comics are a great motivator for our students, and they can engage them in not only literacy, but the other content areas. But have we been able to actually get some good hard data that shows that we can increase the kinds of numbers that, well, let's say that the grants, sponsorships, and our testing requires? So most everybody in this room then is familiar with this hierarchy, basically Bloom's taxonomy, and it's a way of developing a higher order of thinking and depth of knowledge. We use questioning strategies basically to go up this hierarchy, and starting with knowledge and comprehension, we have to apply, and that's what most of the other folks on the panel today are going to be talking about, the application of this theory in the classroom. And then we need to analyze and then evaluate, and that's where it comes to doing the testing that we need to make sure that these types of methods are effective. One of the first texts that I read was by Dr. Stephen Carey, Going Graphic, and if you're not familiar with his work, this also crosses over into the ELL area and gets involved with second language acquisition. One of the first studies that was also early on was by Dr. Liu, and it basically showed that if you have a less proficient student, then comics would actually increase their ability to do higher and lower text. It had some effect on higher learners, but not as much. So it's great for lower learners.
So with that idea that basically every course is a reading course fundamentally, right? We're talking about history right now, but if your reading comprehension isn't there, you can't do the coursework. And this is a value add for comprehension across any and all subjects.
Exactly. So again, these are the foundational and fundamental building blocks that we've used, everything to going back to Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. This basically maps how we acquire language and how it ties in with sequential art. And also schema, which is very important when we go back to our background knowledge and go to our earliest learning experiences. Many of us do that through animation or through cartoons and comics. So you can get the fundamental of like a 3-panel strip like Harriman's Crazy Cat, or even 4 panels with Calvin and Hobbes, and you get into the whole idea that you can tell a story in the most simplest language. It's that combination of words and pictures that's known as dual coding theory, where we're using right and left brain at the same time. We also tie in media literacy, which is how we absorb and analyze with critical thought different media images we have. And you can see that when you get to somebody like R. Crumb, who is a very critical thinker in cartooning, all you need are the pictures to see the development sequentially of what's happened, and that's a great way to learn too. If you're tying in Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences, I guess you might focus on linguistic and spatial for comics. And then you get into the creation of comics in the classroom, where you're breaking down the 5 W's and H. This is a graphic organizer that many early learners use. And then you get into the work of Katie Monin, who has a number of different great textbooks for teaching graphic novels, but also engaging the kids in the creation of comics in the classroom. she has this great graphic organizer where you can take a text or graphic novel and break it down into its elements. And then what we do is we usually get kids to create their own summaries or cause and effect, and that's how this ultimately leads into history and social studies, because the sequential art maps with the way that historical events occur. All right, moving right along to Tim, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, and so just real quick on that too, as you know, we showed and shared that because understanding that the high level idea of why comics are valuable educational tools, you're going to run into a lot of people who you're answerable to, but are not at this convention. They haven't drank our Kool-Aid, and so we want to try and empower you with as many reasons and rationales as we can. But Tim here is going to start talking about the practical sides of things.
Sure. So I was lucky enough that a PBS editor happened to read one of my blogs about connecting to students through comic books. And so in about March that was published, and I had met resistance from the higher level of my own school district about using comics in the classroom, and then they kind of had nowhere to go from there. So there's a lot of evidence here, and I learned a lot from people, and I'll share some of my own students' words and the impact that this has had with them. So I've only really been doing this for a few months in terms of kind of getting the word out there, and thank God for social media, because I was on an island in my school, and now we're talking about people all over the world and everybody else, and it's like we're all out there, and so how do we get this together? So there's a lot of evidence here. So this is the first year I kind of went all out in my classroom. And some of my friends on social media, on Facebook, will say, what do you teach, 2nd grade? No, I teach high school. And I want my students to read. Reading begets reading. And so I try to share different comic books and things. And that Miles Morales poster right there really sticks out, because that's how I was able to connect to an African-American student who was economically disadvantaged, who I could not get through to. And I put that the comic book in my room 2 years ago. And he said, wait a minute, Spider-Man's black? And all of a sudden we started having this conversation, right? This real tough guy kid. And so on the side, I was bringing him into comic books once or twice a month as they were coming out. And we had a really great rapport. And so I was able to connect with him through that. And it's great to see, even with my own kids, I have 3 kids of my own, that anybody can be any hero, right? And I'll talk more about that later. So I teach advanced placement. I teach academic, I teach honors, I teach gifted, I teach 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. I've been a department chair, I've been a curriculum writer. So I've been through the whole thing, and my master's degree is as a reading specialist. And in 2007 is when I pitched this idea of using comic books in the classroom. And the whole cohort really kind of looked at me like, what? And I was lucky enough to have professors who were like, yeah, go with it. And I did make a lot of converts, because in the beginning the conversation was, we were talking about these books and why boys don't read. And my son was termed a reluctant reader, so I take that very personal. And I said, well, what are you giving your students to read? Yeah, I don't want to read that. No, I don't like that title either. Anna Karenina, that almost killed me in high school. And I like to read, and I like to read a lot. And this is also a form of literature, and reading is reading. And we need to understand that. And so a lot of the resistance we get is from people who have not read a comic book for the last 30 years, and they don't understand how things have changed. Got next, yeah. So when I was given this opportunity from Josh to teach on this panel with these guys who wrote a fantastic book, Action Philosophers, that I've actually used in my classroom. And I use it in my Advanced Placement European History course. And so we've always given the students the Communist Manifesto to read. And I always said, this is the driest, most boring, most important book you will ever read. And all of a sudden I come across this book, and there's Karl Marx saying, I kick ass for the proles. I have their attention, right? And if we can flip to the next. So these kinds of questions, these are high-level questions that I'm asking students in an advanced placement course, and they're using this comic to answer these questions, and they get it. And then we read the Communist Manifesto. We have the background. They have it, and they're excited about it. And they say, the other students in the school will say, wait a minute, Mr. Smythe gives you comics, my teacher takes them from me, right? And so it's kind of one of those classrooms, right?
I mean, there's that old cliche of the kid hiding the comic inside the textbook, right? You know, the whole reason that we created our Comics to Make Kids Smarter, which we originally called the graphic textbook, was let's make the comic the textbook. The content is the content, and that's what your whole classroom experience is born out to.
Yeah. So I'll try to finish up real quick. So the next slide is an example of. No, they kind of got it over. There we go. So I use Kyle Baker. It's the first comic that I use in my classroom, and it's basically a wordless graphic novel. Nat Turner's, Kyle Baker's Nat Turner. And through these visualizations, you see these light bulbs going off in the kid's head. Wait a minute, that's just like the Jewish Holocaust. That's like the tattoos. That's like the concentration camps. And so you can do a lot in these panels, anywhere from an ELL kid to an advanced placement kid, and depending on what you do with that. And so then we start talking about the African Holocaust, that there's more than one Holocaust. We're talking about 18 million people who died as a result of all of this, and you can do this through a very simple comic, but yet it takes a long time to go through that. And the best part about this is it teaches evidence-based research. It teaches them textual evidence, visual evidence, same idea, right? What's on the next? So kind of the same idea there is anybody can be a hero. It's such a powerful hook for our students. And so I purposely decorate my room with all these different superheroes. And I love that my kids are growing up in an age where, Captain America is black. Oh, he's also white. So is Spider-Man. But the idea here is there's a lot of diversity here, and it's a great thing to see. What's next? So here's a quote from one of my students, and she says, well, you can read through that, but they've written a lot of, the idea is that we've interacted with a lot of artists and authors and things, and so a lot of the students will say, the first lesson we do is I'll give the students a lot of my babies. I'll give them my comic books in the beginning of the year, and from different decades, and I have them research them as historical artifacts. What can you tell us about society and how has it changed from a comic from the 60s and 70s or one that's today? And in the beginning, a lot of these kids will say, I always thought comic books were nerds or things like that. But then there's also those 5 kids in every class who are like, this is awesome. And by the time we're done with this, they're making these connections, and it sticks. And it sticks, right? What else? What's next? I'm sorry.
Historycomics.net.
Oh, okay. So yeah, without getting into all the whatever, so I put a lot of things on historycomics.net, lesson plans, that's all what we want as teachers. We want to leave a convention with what can I do tomorrow. So there's a lot of stuff on there to take a look at. I would welcome anybody to give me feedback and lesson plans, ideas, and things like that. Next up, we're teaching March, the graphic novel, with a teacher in Norway. So we're talking about civil rights there and here. Starting next week, I'm really excited about this. I went out and spent, don't tell my wife, I don't know, about $100 and some to buy 30 copies of this comic book. But the stormtroopers are the good guys because it's from their point of view. And so through this comic book, you can teach that, but they need to tell me, why do you think that way? And so the next slide, I think, is the last one. This is just part of the lesson. Pick out the textual evidence. Why do you think this way? Did it challenge the way that you think? And that's the other thing is, just the last thing is, some people who don't know me might think that I'm a really easy kind of a teacher. Oh, he does comic books. No, I'm probably one of the hardest teachers in my school. This is one method. This is not all that I do. This is one method to kind of hook these kids and get them excited in a different way.
Yeah, and that idea is we want to add tools to your toolkit. Right now, in the educational system, a lot of problems are viewed as nails because all you have is hammers. And we want to say, no, let's look at some Allen wrenches. Maybe, there's a lot of stuff in there. Good Phillips screwdriver. Yeah, absolutely. So, now I believe it's time for Miss Callista Brill to tell us about the history of history.
Cool.
For a second.
Hi everyone, my name is Callista Brill. I am the executive editor at First Second Books. How many people in this room are familiar with First Second? We're a graphic novel publisher. Oh, cool, all right. So very quickly, First Second is a graphic novel publisher. We are an imprint at Macmillan. We are a trade publisher, and we only publish graphic novels. Our books span all genres and ages. And so the slides that you're going to be seeing here are just a selection of some history-themed and history-focused graphic novels that we've published in the last 5 years or so. And I guess I thought it would be sort of interesting to tell you guys a little bit about my perspective as an editor when it comes to graphic novels that are about historical events. Because they present some interesting creative challenges. And I think your action philosopher friends are going to be probably touching on this as well. But one thing that I have to think about really carefully when I'm editing a history graphic novel is this actually history or is it historical fiction? Okay? And I think with prose, that is a distinction that can be pretty clearly made, and with comics it is much harder to make that distinction clearly because the very nature of the comics, you are drawing people, you're putting clothing on their bodies. Was that what they wore that day? We don't know. You're putting words in the word balloons. Is that what they said in that conversation? We don't know, right? You're putting them in a room. Is that the room they were in? Maybe not, right? So there is this enormous level of creative fill-in-the-blank that the author and editor of a historical comic have to be doing. And so we were pretty careful with these books to always include a disclaimer at the front that basically says, you know, we've categorized this as nonfiction. You know, the BISAC categories for these books are always nonfiction. We believe that they should be categorized as nonfiction, but it's important to acknowledge that a great deal of editorial license goes into the creation of these books. And to me, this is not a problem. To me, this is a wonderful thing. And I think that there's also an extent to which anybody who's writing nonfiction, especially historical nonfiction, is taking authorial license. And sometimes that's not acknowledged, and sometimes we pretend like nonfiction prose designed for classroom use is somehow irreproachably true, you know, and like the final word and definitely how it happened, and that's never the case. We always bring our own biases to the table, you know, if not the author's bias, then the society's bias that they are writing in. And one of the things that I really like about working on graphic novels is that they place historical events in a context that is so approachable and so immersive because of the visual element, and that feels so personally relatable because of the visual element, that it really brings these historical events into a kind of a more intimate effect than I think just reading about them in prose would have. And it's interesting, you know, I think we occasionally get people who are concerned about the level of invention that goes into them, but not as often as you would think, because I think that the value of these books is so obvious and so strong. A couple of the books that we've been looking at that I'm particularly sort of fervently in favor of. I love all my children equally, of course, but I particularly love The Photographer, which is sort of a great case of more rigorous nonfiction in comics because
That's a great book.
it is wonderful, yeah. Pick up a copy of this book if you guys can find it, especially those of you who are teaching current events and sociology at the high school level. It is the story of a photojournalist, Didier Lefebvre, he was embedded with a Doctors Without Borders mission in rural Afghanistan in the 1980s during the Soviet invasion. And the book very cleverly combines his actual photographs from that trip with